So I'm Rachael Hanel. I'm on the planning committee for the Deep Valley Book Festival. So I've been involved with the book festival for many years now. And I live just outside of Mankato, where I've lived almost all of my life. I was born in southern Minnesota. I grew up in Waseca, which is about 30 miles away from Mankato. So I've always lived here. I've done a few different things as far as my career. I started as a newspaper journalist and copy editor. But then I got into teaching at the university level, and I really loved that. And so that is where I am right now. I teach at Minnesota State University, Mankato. I actually teach in the mass communications department, which is basically journalism, just because that is my background. And my work experience is in news. And so I teach news writing. I don't teach creative writing, but creative writing is just something that I've done, on the side. But so I have a memoir. This is my memoir. Will be the last ones to let you down, memoir of a Gravedigger's Daughter. This came out 8 years ago already. And my dad was a gravedigger, hence the title. And when I was, I was probably about 25 years old, I just started to think more about that. I started to think about growing up in that environment where my dad was a gravedigger. He also mowed and maintained cemeteries. And so I spent a lot of time in cemeteries as a young child. And clearly that really formed me. It formed who I am. It formed how I think about things. And so I thought, I would like to explore that. I knew that this moment of time growing up in a cemetery or being in a cemetery frequently, I knew that shaped me somehow. I didn't know exactly how it shaped me, but I wanted to explore that. I wanted to learn more. So I just started to write. I just started to write the stories and the things I could remember from growing up in the cemetery. And then my own family also had a lot of its own grief and loss. My grandparents had gone through grief and loss. And then my dad died when I was 15. He died unexpectedly. So then there was a whole reckoning with that, as growing up in cemeteries and pretty familiar with death and grief. What did that mean when it actually happened to my own family? And so I explored that in the book as well. So I loved writing it. It was a great process to write it. It was really, I guess, therapeutic, and that's maybe not the best word, but it was was therapeutic. It helped me just really kind of solidify what my dad meant to me and what it meant to grow up in that environment. It was very enlightening, I guess I would say. But I continue to write memoir and essays. I'm working on a manuscript right now, a narrative nonfiction manuscript. So this is my published book. It looks like that once it comes out. This is my next book in manuscript form. So working through that right now. But that's more of a biography, but it's nonfiction. So I feel very comfortable in the nonfiction world. I think because of my journalism background, that they said, don't make anything up, which that was 25 years ago. Things maybe changed a little bit in the world of journalism since then, but don't make anything up. So I find it very hard to make anything up. So I stick exclusively working in memoir and nonfiction. So with that being said, I will get to my notes. Hopefully that gives me a little bit more credibility to talk about memoir. And I love reading memoir too. Like I just love memoir. I love reading it. I love learning about people. I love people's stories. So I guess I consider myself a student of memoir or a connoisseur of memoir. So I just put together some notes for us today. What I think a memoir needs. So this is just culled from my own experiences from reading a lot of memoirs, from reading a lot of craft books about memoirs. I just try to read everything I can about the craft and really stay current with it and stay on top of it. So I've boiled it down. We don't have a lot of time today, and I could go into a lot more detail, but I'm going to boil it down to the basics. So if you're thinking about writing about yourself or writing about family, here's what you would need going forward. So 4 characteristics. I say there's 4 characteristics that memoir needs. It needs to be true. You need to have a focus. There needs to be some kind of transformation. Something had to have changed And then there needs to be what's called an inner story. So I'll talk about each one of these in more detail here. Truth. So I guess I'm starting with the most complicated one. You would think the idea of truth would be pretty clear cut, like something's true and something's not true, but it's not that simple. And especially when it comes to our memories, I think we can all identify with the situation. Let's say we're at a Thanksgiving dinner, we're with our family, and you're telling stories about growing up, and you say one thing, and then your sibling or somebody says, that's not what happened, that didn't happen that way. And then now suddenly you have these competing, conflicting stories, and what's true? You know, if you both have very distinct memories of what happened, what's actually true? And that can be very difficult to discern unless somebody was there with a tape recorder or a video camera, and life doesn't work that way. So you're left with kind of the truth of memory. And that's what you have to deal with in memoir. You have to base it on your own memories of how something happened. If that's how it happened, like if that's how you remember it happening, that's how it happened, you know, and that's the truth. So it's only if you can find like really clear evidence that it didn't happen that way, which sometimes happens, you know, you can do some digging to try to find out what exactly happened. But if you don't have that kind of evidence, then you are left with what we call emotional truth. What is the emotional truth of the story? If you feel like it happened to you that way, to the best of your memory, that's the only thing you have to go on. And for memoir, that's going to be good enough. Now, that might sound kind of weird, and there are a lot of conflicting viewpoints on that. So in this particular chart, I just threw a couple of names out there of people who have written nonfiction, and they have wildly different ideas of what the truth is. So on one hand, on the left side there, I have Sam Friedman, who is somebody who would be more journalistic. He wrote a great book about his mother called Who She Was. So his mother had died when he was fairly young. I think he was 20. So he's like a historian. He's like a journalist. He goes through every piece of evidence he can find about his mother to recreate the story of who his mother was, especially when she was a young woman. And he says in the book, he says, if I could not find any evidence, I didn't put it in there. This is very much a journalistic account, but it's very well written. It's not dry. You know, he was able to make it very compelling, but he was a journalist. I think he worked for the New York Times. And so he is really holding on to that idea of if he can't document it, he's not going to write it. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then there's a guy whose name is John DeGatta, and he is on the other end of the spectrum. And he is more concerned with creatively, how can he tell a story? And if that means changing some details in order to make a better story, in order to, you know, have maybe a better alliteration or kind of a more lyrical, poetic way of writing something, if he needs to change some details, he's going to do that, because to him, how the story is told is the most important part of nonfiction. Now, in that spectrum, these are two very opposite ends of the spectrum. Within that spectrum, there's so many like middle points, and it's really up to you as the writer to figure out what's your position. How do you feel about the truth? What's going to be your definition of the truth? And that's good enough. So you may get pushback. You may get readers saying, oh, how could you really remember that detail? Maybe you have dialogue in your memoir. Oh, how do you remember exactly what people said 30 years ago? You know, you might get people questioning that, and they can. And some people do, but if that's the way you want to approach it, that is your way. You know, it's really up to you as the writer, and you have that artistic control. So John DeGatta can make those artistic choices. Sam Friedman can make those artistic choices. Now, do I agree? You know, I think personally, I think Sam Friedman is a little too narrow. I think he's a little too strict. You know, I think he could be a little bit more creative in the way that he's approaching that. I think John DeGatta, I think he's flat out making things up. I don't agree with that. but that's their choices. And as a reader, I don't have to read it if I don't agree with it. But I just wanted to let you know that there are really a lot of different viewpoints about what is true. And so my own definition of the truth when I write nonfiction is, if I remembered it that way, I'm writing it to the best of my ability. I'm writing it how I remembered. If I can find evidence to support what I'm writing, I will go find it. I'm not knowingly making things up. So that's kind of where I draw the line. I am not going to knowingly change something to be false just because I think it sounds better or I think it serves the story better. I'm not going to do that, but other people may make different decisions. And again, it's just up to you as the artist, as the writer. There needs to be a focus. So a memoir is focused upon a particular theme. It's often focused to a particular moment in time. They're often centered around major life events, a death or a divorce, childhood, a coming of age memoir, maybe an illness, maybe a trip, a journey, traveling. We want that focus, because if we don't have that focus, suddenly you have a book that is just kind of a collection of tidbits or anecdotes throughout an entire life. And they may be funny, they may be poignant, they may be really, really well written, but it can feel to the reader a little bit out of focus. If you're going from childhood and now you're an adult and now you're retired and you just have kind of this collection of memories, it can just feel a little scattered. So we do want to focus on really hone in on something particular. And so for me in my memoir, it was growing up in cemeteries, being around death and grief. So I only wrote those stories that had to deal directly with that theme. And it was pretty focused in time too. It was basically my childhood. My dad died when I was 15. I go a little bit beyond that, like high school and a little bit past that, but not much. So it's a pretty narrow timeline of my life. Clearly, a lot of things have happened to me since then. A lot of things happened to me when I was a child that didn't have to do with the cemeteries. I did not write any of that. I kept it very focused to a particular theme. Something also has to change. There has to be a transformation. So if it's just a collection of memories, again, it doesn't have that kind of meaning to the reader that you want your reader to have. If it's just like this hodgepodge of different events and different memories, like I said, they can be great, they can be funny and poignant, like I said, but something really needs to change. Who you are at the beginning of that story and who you are at the end of the story has to be different. And that's why we do get so many memoirs about those themes that I put on the previous slide, because in terms of death or divorce or grief or illness, something has changed. Like those are very momentous, transformative moments in people's lives. They kind of naturally lend themselves to memoir. So you want to take readers on a journey with you of this change. And even if you're not writing about yourself, if you're writing about somebody else, same thing applies. Like, how have they changed? What is it about their story that shows some kind of change? And can you show readers that? So that transformation is really key to a lot of stories. I mean, I think even fictional stories, that it's just really kind of the basis of storytelling. Something has to change over the course of the story. And then we have this concept of inner story. So the outer story is the story that's really the obvious story. It's kind of the facts of the matter. For me, the outer story would be, I grew up in Waseca. I was born in 1974. Like these very concrete facts that nobody can dispute. Like those are not disputable facts. And my dad was a gravedigger and I grew up there and I went to school there. That's the outer story, kind of these things that we can see. But that inner story is what I make of it. That inner story just puts that meaning, puts that attachment to it. So I can have this outer story of death and grief and my dad died, but that inner story is suddenly, what does it all mean? And like I said earlier, when I set out to write this memoir, I knew that this experience had changed me. I couldn't articulate it. So I decided to write to find out. So that would be the inner story. You know, how did this experience change me? How did growing up in that environment change me or form me? That's the inner story. And that's what you want to think about. You want to think about that meaning, because that's what's going to resonate with readers. That is what's going to get them to attach to your story. Because if I want readers to identify with me, how many of my readers grew up in Waseca? How many of them had a dad who was a gravedigger? Like, my story is very specific to me, and that the facts of that story aren't going to relate to very many people. But suddenly, if I have an inner story that says, oh, here's how I dealt with loss, or here's the kind of grief that I went through, suddenly that's a story that everyone can relate to, because probably everybody has gone through a loss of their own, or they've gone through grief. So to read about how I dealt with it, suddenly you have that meaning that can resonate with readers. So that inner story piece of it is really important. And I just have a little chart here that shows that. You know, with the outer story, you can really think about it as kind of that journalistic piece, you know, just reporting on the who, what, when, why, and when, like the facts of the story. Sometimes that outer story is chronological. You know, it's easier to tell a story chronologically, and it's necessary. Like in a memoir, you need that. You need both of these, because that outer story, like those details are going to ground the reader. They're going to ground them in that place. You're going to use descriptions of people and of places, and that just really helps your readers envision this place that you're writing about, or the people that you're encountering. And then the inner story is the why. Why? Or the so what? Who cares? Why is this story important? Why would other people want to read this story? And you're really there to discover that meaning, discover what it all means. And it's not going to be obvious. It's not going to be obvious at the outset. And I really would recommend for memoir writers to not know those things when they start writing. I didn't know. Like I said, I just had this general idea of, I knew this experience had formed me, but I didn't know how. So I figured that out by writing. And that keeps the writing fresh, because you want readers, you kind of want to hold readers by the hand and take them on that journey of discovery with you. And if it feels canned, or if it feels forced, or if it feels scripted, like they knew from the beginning what this meaning was going to be, readers can tell. So I think you just have to go into memoir with a really open mind, with a kind of a general idea of that transformative moment, or a general idea of what maybe the inner story could be, but be willing to change, be willing to just go with it, and be willing to be open to all possibilities when you sit down to write. And I think this is what makes memoir writing really, really hard. It's hard. Now, I don't write other types of writing, so I'm not going to say memoir writing is the hardest writing that there is. But if you think about writing fiction, and you aren't constrained by anything, you know, you can just write what you want because you're making it up, you know, unless it's historical fiction. Then, I mean, you are going to be constrained at some points. But with a memoir, it just involves so much thinking, and you can't plan it out. I mean, I think when I was writing this, there was an equal amount of time that I was actually in front of the computer writing, and then more time where I was just like this, like just thinking, you know, just having some quiet time to really think about my story. And so for me, it was very, very time consuming. It was a very long and plodding process. This was not a book that I could have kind of whipped out quickly. And when I hear of memoirists writing things really quickly, I get suspicious, because I think it's very, very hard. And I think to put in that thought process and that journey of discovery, I don't think that can happen quickly. So to help you kind of think about the inner story and outer story, if you have a little notebook with you, or a computer or something where you can just jot down a few notes, I want you to think about your first job. What was your first job? And I just want you to jot down, like, where was it? What were you doing? Where was it? Did you have a boss? Did you have coworkers? Can you just kind of describe like where you were and what you were doing and that kind of thing? So I can give you a couple of minutes to do that. I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to also see if there's any questions, which it doesn't really look like it. Check my various sources here. Questions to the side. Text message questions. If you do have any questions, just go ahead and throw them in the box and I can get to them. But yeah, just take a couple of minutes here to jot down things about your first job. That is a good question, Victoria. I do have suggestions, which I will talk about. I can talk a little bit about that toward the end of the book. I can pop them into the chat box with the names of the books. So I'll get that list compiled for you there, Victoria. That's a great question. Margaret, that's a great question. Should we change the names to protect the innocent? I think if you can avoid changing names, that's the best. Just because the story rings more true, if you're using real names. There were two instances in my memoir where I changed names, and that was more for a privacy issue. They weren't my stories, they were stories of people I knew. And they were very sensitive stories. And I thought, I think I'm just going to change the name there because it's kind of like they kind of weren't my stories to tell. I mean, I was observing these stories, so I'm writing about them like through my filter, but just because the topic was just a little sensitive, I changed the names. But that was the only two times that I did that. Reposting the 4 elements of memoir. I can certainly do that. And then we can get to finish up that exercise because I have a couple of more questions. Actually, while I type in the 4 elements of memoir in the chat box. Okay, you've had a couple of minutes to describe your first job. Now, I also want you to take a couple of minutes. I want you to jot down, what did you learn from that first job? Was there something about that job that taught you something? And if so, what was that? It could have been like being on time or, I don't know, handling money or something like that. But was there something that you learned by working in that job? So do that for a couple of minutes. I'll repost the 4 elements of memoir. And yeah, I would invite people to share in the chat box, kind of the lesson maybe that you learned working that first job, and kind of see what people have to say there. But I can also answer some questions here. What if a lot of your topics are sensitive, trauma and abuse, changing your own name? Yeah, Kim, that's a very good question because, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't address really a lot of legalities, but that certainly is a consideration if you feel like you do have these stories where there was a crime or there was trauma, there was abuse, and maybe people weren't punished for that, so in that case, I would say if there something is very traumatic, very sensitive, especially if it hasn't been resolved somehow, then certainly changing names can be the way to go, to kind of even protect yourself, from legal issues that could arise from something like that. And then as far as, changing your own name, like writing under a pseudonym, with memoir, that just gets really tricky. So you kind of have to just really ask yourself, if you're okay with that, if you're prepared for that. Honestly, like I can't think of any memoirs that were written under a different name. I'm sure they're out there, but it's not something that I just really don't ever come across that. So I think I would just explore that a little bit more of maybe the reasons that would be behind that, and what could happen if you had published under your own name. First jobs. Yeah, working at a grocery store, working at a roadside fruit stand, Brittany. It sounds like that could be kind of a weird job. So, it sounds like that could be a job where maybe you learned a lot about people, or maybe kind of encountered some interesting characters doing that. Drapery sweatshop, boredom. Susan, that is a really good example of that inner story. That, okay, you have kind of the facts of this job where it's just boring, and you kind of see all these women working there. They've worked there their whole lives, and you're thinking, yeah, I think maybe I should go get an education, because like you could see firsthand that could be something you were facing, or that could have very much been your life if you had kept with that. So that's a great example of inner story. And that's really what this exercise is designed to do, to help you understand what the outer story is and what the inner story is. So in this case, the outer story is just the facts of your first job. Where was it? When was it? What did you do? Who did you work with? That kind of thing. And then the inner story would be kind of that inner story, like what was in your head, what were your thoughts, what was going through your mind as you were doing this type of job. And so to have a job where you realize, I should get an education, otherwise I'm going to be stuck in a place like this for the rest of my life. That is a great example of an inner story. Victoria, how to say no. How to be your own person. You're not going to shorten that uniform. That's pretty great. Learning about rules, learning how rules can be helpful, but also how they could also be restrictive. That's really great, Helen. Yeah, Kirsten weighs in with the names of real people. Yeah, that really is a whole other issue. I mean, it really is, and there's a lot that can be said about that. First job lessons, paying attention to people, being friendly. That's pretty important. Yeah, Victoria, that's a good point. So she says in the last issue of Writer's Digest, there was a good article on memoir writing and how to avoid being sued, which they said is very rare. It is very rare. So I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a lawyer, but I do teach journalism. So I know quite a bit about the First Amendment and from a journalism perspective, how to avoid being sued. When you write something in a newspaper, it is very rare because it's very difficult to prove, because we do have the First Amendment. The First Amendment is generally very, very generous to speech and to print here in the United States. So it is rare. Certainly there are ways to get sued. And if you're concerned about that, I would say consultant expert. If you think it's a very real possibility that you're doing the kind of writing where you feel like you could get into legal issues, I would absolutely contact a lawyer to make sure that that you would be avoiding those kind of things. Being upset about what somebody has written and actually suing them because you're upset are two very different things. People will be upset with you. They will absolutely be upset with you. People were upset with me. But they would have no reason to sue me just because they were upset. So it happens. People get upset. Let's see here. Lots of first job stories. Candling eggs. Melinda can only eat scrambled eggs to this day. Yeah, that sounds like that could be quite a job there. It looks like we have a question here from Paula. She wrote a book as a journal. And so in that journal format, she had run-on sentences, exclamation points, wrote as she lived it and would have read it. So she's asking, is that a style? Like, should she have cleaned it up or kind of maybe proper sentences? She said it got good reviews, but wonder if she could have made it more of a book. That's just a very personal question, Paula. There is something to be said for maybe kind of that free association, that very rawness. Journals are very raw, where you're just writing and things are flowing and thoughts are flowing and you're not really paying a lot of attention to, oh, is this proper and that kind of thing. So you're capturing something with that kind of writing. So then it's just really becomes up to you. Like, is that the point you want to make, that kind of stream of consciousness, and that, do you think that will resonate with people, or do you think that it needs to be a little bit more formed? So we have a lot of artistic choices, and I'm glad that people seem to like it. So you must have been doing something right, that it was that you were able to have people resonate with that as readers. I'm just kind of looking here for some more questions. Yeah, the comments about first jobs are just great. So it's clear that you are understanding, what it takes to have that outer story and that inner story, and what was that meaning of your first job. So like any one of you could now just write an essay about your first job, because now you have an outer story and an inner story. So that would make a nice little memoir in short form there. Let's see. Got lots of active people here today. That's great. I think I maybe have addressed all of the questions that people had for the moment. And so you can certainly throw some more questions my way. I'm going to share my screen another time here, because I have another just set of prompts that you could work through if you wanted to. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, here's another writing exercise that I like people to do. I just want you to think about an image, a memory, maybe it's an object that just keeps popping up in your head, something that you just really can't let go. So this maybe might have happened a long time ago, but it's something that you can still really clearly see. Or if it's an object that you still have. And an object in this case would be that type of object that that you carry with you, that you always have, that you take from place to place if you move a lot. And maybe people say, why do you have that thing? Why are you still hanging on to that thing? Maybe they just don't quite get it, but it's yours, it's something that you want to keep having. So one thing you can do is just write down a few notes about this memory or this object and describe it. So kind of like what you did with the first job exercise. Describe the object, describe the memory, but then also attach that meaning to it. Then again, it's another way to really explore that inner story or that outer story. For my book, this is actually what started my whole book. Is I was in a writing class at the university, And, we had an assignment to write about a memory. And so I was young. I might have been in grad school, but there was a gravestone that I always remembered. And it was from one of the cemeteries that my dad mowed. And I would always go to this gravestone because there was a picture on it. So there was a picture of a young girl on it. She was 15 years old when she died. And this was a time when you didn't really have pictures on gravestones. I mean, it was an actual photograph and it was underneath a clasp. And so you like lifted up the clasp and you would see the photograph. So it was very tangible. It was very tactile. And I just thought she was so beautiful. And I always stopped at her grave and I always looked at her picture. And I would every time I was there, I would go there. So when I'm 25, I'm still thinking about this picture on this gravestone. And I thought, I just think about this thing all the time and I'm just going to write about it. And so I wrote about it. So I described it. I described what it looked like. But then I thought, what did that mean? Like, why do I keep thinking about this? And I realized that that was really my first introduction to mortality. I was very young when I first came across this, maybe 4 or 5 years old. And so to realize that somebody so young and so beautiful could die, that was really, it was really an eye opener. It really kind of shaped my thinking of death from that point on. So that was the inner story. So I have this outer story of this gravestone in this picture, and I could describe that. But then I have this inner story of what did it mean to me to see that and to be so fascinated with it. And that was actually the story that started my whole memoir. So that was the first thing I ever wrote. And I wrote it for a class, and so I got some feedback on it. And then that just prompted me to think that there were more stories like that there were more stories that kind of taught me different lessons about grief and loss and death. And I thought, if I start to just write them all, like I just wrote this one, I might have a whole book at some point. So I just kept writing based on that particular anecdote. So, this type of writing exercise for all of you, who knows, maybe it's going to start a whole book idea for you. Somebody who Teresa asked, how do you handle people being upset with you? People who you wrote about or people in the community who might have reactions? Well, as a writer, you do need to have a pretty thick skin. Because people get upset for a variety of reasons. And kind of what I discovered is they're not really upset about the writing. They're not upset about the story. Maybe they have some kind of personal relationship with you that maybe has always been fraught. Maybe they're kind of the jealous type. Maybe they see your writing and a book being published as a success, and maybe that makes them feel kind of icky inside. And so they kind of lash out and tell people, that your story's not very good or something. But that's my experience. I think it's often not about the actual writing. That's not about the actual book, that there's probably some larger personal dynamics that are going on there. In my case, if you've read my book, well, thank you. But if you've read it, you will realize it is not, crazy drama story. It's really pretty quiet. It's not, a shocker, or, it's not a Lifetime movie or anything like that. So, but you would be surprised, the people who get upset just simply because you chose to speak. There's a lot of people that would just rather have stories, even if they're not very dramatic, but if they're just personal or family stories, that they don't want you to say them. They want you to stay quiet. And so that can be a lot behind people being upset. But, if somebody is criticizing you or criticizing your book, like if I don't know them, I don't care. I don't know this person. I'm not going to let them bother me or upset me. I don't even know them. But with people that I knew who maybe weren't very happy with the book, it generally was a relationship that wasn't good to begin with. A relationship that there had been struggles already. So for somebody like that to be upset, that also didn't really bother me, because I knew there was probably something more going on underneath the surface there. So that is my 2 cents on handling upset people. Yeah, thank you, Joy. Thank you, Cindy. You're all both very kind. Jim says, with his own memoirs, he has a statement at the beginning, introductions, acknowledgements, that he is not out there to vilify or defame anyone, but to describe his experiences. I think that's great, Jim, because I think that just does cover the basis. Like, I don't think it's necessary, but I think it's a good practice because you've hit upon like what I talked about with that truth factor, where those are your memories and nobody can argue with them because they're your memories, but they might have different memories. But in that acknowledgement, you're saying, hey, this is how I remember it. And it's not my intent to say your version is wrong, but this is simply my version. I'm going to tell it how I know it, and that's my intent there. So I think it's smart to do something like that. Good to know, Victoria, that article in Writer's Digest. So yeah, if people are looking for more information about kind of the legalities of writing in this Writer's Digest article, I'm sure you can just Google it, and it's probably out there to be available to read online. Mira asks, suggestions for getting to the inner story. It takes time. So if you can journal, if you can spend some time just kind of quietly thinking, maybe don't necessarily be in a rush to write it all down, but just I think once you put some thought into it, it'll come, you'll kind of have that discovery of, oh, that's what it means, after you kind of put yourself in that zone to just think a little bit about what it means. That's what I would suggest. So I would just suggest patience, to have patience when it comes to figuring out like the meaning of a story. And I know a lot of you, might be in this session, maybe you're not interested in writing your own story per se, but maybe you want to write family stories. Maybe you want to get these stories down before they're lost. Maybe your parents have great stories or siblings, and you want to pass them down to the next generation. And that's certainly a really valuable thing to do, to kind of get these stories down. And so I know a lot of people will almost simply just do like oral histories of their families and kind of write down stories as people told them and put them together and have them out for the family. And that works really well. But I think that any story, any family story, can go a little bit deeper, where you can kind of get into the inner story or the inner meaning. And even if it's a story that you intend to only keep within your family just because you want some kind of legacy to pass down, if you can attach that inner story to those stories, it just becomes that much more richer and that much more like fascinating and interesting for people to read, even if they're just your family. So I think there's ways to make those kind of stories just really entertaining too. And if you're in a situation where you are trying to get family stories down, and maybe you're doing oral histories, you're interviewing family members, try to prompt them, like, describe your first job, Dad, and then say, what do you think that meant? Or how do you think that changed you? Kind of asking those questions that will lead to more uncovering of an inner story or more uncovering of a transformation would lead to some really rich details, I think, that would really entertain people. Thank you, Barb, for saying that about my book. And Mike said, just he sits down, writes what he remembers. Then he talked with his brother, and that helped to add details. And so he asked, do you support sharing memoir early? I did some of that same thing too. I didn't ever share my writing, like an actual Word document, but I did have a lot of conversations with my mom and my sister. And I would say, tell me again about this event or this person, or here's how I remember this particular thing. What can you tell me about it? I think there is kind of that bouncing ideas off back and forth. If there's someone you trust, like as long as you have a good relationship and you kind of trust this person and you're just trying to get more information, I think it can be a nice way to almost like triangulate the data a little bit. And, if I remembered something and then my sister would tell me that she remembered it totally differently, I mean, I would think about that. I would think, well, is there a way to really find out what really happened? Maybe I do need to look into this more. Are there other people I can ask? I mean, you can kind of find if you're on the right path or not, but like, as far as actually sharing writing, I don't want to do that because I don't want like that many comments or that many voices on what I consider my own story. So I consider it like my own story once I've written it. And at that point, then I don't want to share it. with other people, but kind of verbally checking in and comparing stories, I think that's a good way to go. Yes, Joan. Thank you for that, Joan, because it's probably been about 8 years since I read my acknowledgements. I don't remember that was in there, but and I've seen this in a lot of memoirs too, where you kind of do make that blanket statement, kind of what Jim was alluding to earlier too, of this is my story, I'm sorry if anybody disagrees, or these are my memories, the way that I remember it, I think can be helpful. Oh, that's nice, Susan. Yeah, your name is familiar to me. Oh, it was the first time you'd contacted an author. Well, I hope it was a good experience. I know I was at the panel at 10 o'clock and somebody said that readers often get nervous about, contacting authors, but authors would love nothing more than to hear from their readers. So do that, keep doing that. I do it myself. And I mean, I'm such a fangirl when it comes to authors. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here in a couple of minutes. I just want to share one more slide with you. Oh, and I was also going to type some information into the chat box regarding a couple of books as well. So let me just share one more slide here. I just want you all know, I just want you to all know how to contact me. So that was a good note to kind of end on there, Susan. You can email me, you can go to my website, you can find my blog there. There's my Twitter handle if anybody's on Twitter, Instagram, my Instagram handle. I do have a mailing list. I do have a newsletter. So just really sending out very occasional newsletters that are specific to the craft of writing. I like to offer some writing tips. And then I also am keeping people updated on my current project. It's right now, I'm just trying to get it out there to agents or editors, just trying to get it published at this point. It's written, it's been edited, it's kind of pretty much ready to go there. So if you want to stay updated on that, and if you do subscribe, I have an audio story, a free 9-minute audio story that I would send to you that really summarizes this next book. So if you want kind of a sneak peek of what's coming next, just send me an email. I'll put your email on my mailing address list, and I would really appreciate that kind of support. So I'm going to stop there with the share screen. 2 books I can recommend. Writing the Memoir by Judith Barrington is one, and it has a lot of writing exercises in it. So that's why I really, really like that book. And Tell It Slant by Brenda Miller. Also a book about writing nonfiction that has a lot of writing exercises. So I love books that have writing exercises at the end of them, because I think that just is really a great way to help generate material. It looks like up here somebody had said something about photographs. Yeah, my memoir has photos in it, because I mean, that was just so important to me to help me, think about story and to see pictures of people as I'm writing. That's just wonderful. Yeah, let's see. Oh, shoot. Let me do that again. I just sent those suggestions to one particular person. So Writing the Memoir by Judith Barrington and Tell It Slant by Brenda Miller. Those should be in the chat box now for you to see that. Thanks for letting me know that. We do have also a winner for the drawing, which is my book. So the winner is Mike Lagerquist, but I would have to ask Mike if he already has my book. And if he does he want another copy? If he does have my book, is it signed? Because I could certainly give him a signed copy. But if he has all those bases covered, then I think he will have to just pick out another book from our author list. Oh, on Kindle. Okay, good. We're good then. So I will send you an actual physical copy signed, Mike. So Mike, just email me with your mailing address and I will get that out to you. I think I'm just going to wrap it up now, just because we're kind of a little bit over our time anyway. We didn't want to quite go the whole hour. So if you do have any lingering questions, I'm very easy to find with my email address. I can type that here again too. And website. Very easy to find. So if you have any questions, email me, find me. I'm happy to answer questions. I would love it if you wanted to sign up for my newsletter, get you on that mailing list to stay updated. That would be really wonderful. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate you all being here today. I hope you learned something. It was really kind of a quick hit. So I hope there was something that you could come away with after this presentation. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Coming up at 1 o'clock is a panel discussion, guilty pleasure reading. So that should be just so fun and delightful. So please check that out in just a little over a half hour. Excellent. All good, Madison. I'm assuming Dave Engen is your teacher. And if that's the case, then you're in good hands. I'm glad you could be here. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to end the session now, so have a good day.